Hi, good afternoon. So, today I would like to take an example of how medieval empires could have been seized. I would like to take an example of how Aurangzeb had seized the Mughal Empire from Shah Jahan in the 17th century. Uh, I would like to take out certain points as to how the empires would have been seized during the medieval times. So, let me just start with the story right away. So, firstly, it was the year 1657, and Shah Jahan was seriously ill, and um, and, and there were many reports that would come out about its health. And one report was from a junior artilleryman. He was an Italian person called Niccolo Manosi, and he was an artilleryman in the army of Shah Jahan, and he was a young person, and he would come out with a report saying that Shah Jahan would retain urine for 3 days, and he was almost at the in his own words, he was almost at the death's door. So that's what Niccolo Manosi, the Italian, uh, looking at the proceedings, would conclude. Secondly, there were many other events which would occur, which would confirm that Shah Jahan was seriously ill. The next event was that his own daughter, Jahanara Begum, would enter his palace to take care of him, and the palace here is the Red Fort of Delhi. So Shah Jahan was actually living in Red Fort from 1648 onwards. Right now it is the year 1657. So the doors of the Red Fort. So after Jahanara Begum would enter the palace of Shah Jahan in the Red Fort to take care of him, the doors of the Red Fort would also be closed, and this would strengthen a rumor that went about that said that the emperor was dead already, and it was only a rumor. So, having heard these rumors, the shopkeepers in front of the Red Fort at a place called Chandni Chowk would start burying the treasure and would look in the premises, expecting that there would be a long period of unrest. And you would imagine why unrest, because it was a time when the emperor was possibly dead, according to them, and it was a time when the four sons, the competing sons who were competing for the throne, would begin to fight, and there would be a long period of unrest. So this was the thinking among the shopkeepers at Chandni Chowk at that time. At the same time, there were spies in the Red Fort who would report the events to each of the four sons of Shah Jahan, and here I'm talking about the four sons being. Let me take their names. One is the eldest son of Shah Jahan, and he was the favored person to take the throne after Shah Jahan, favored by Shah Jahan himself, and his name was Dara Shikoh. The second son was called Shah Suja. The third son was Aurangzeb. The fourth son was Murad Baksh. So all these four people had an ambition to raise to the throne, and as soon as they got to know from their spies that Shah Jahan had been ill, and it was possible that there was going to be unrest because there would be battle between these four sons to claim the throne after Shah Jahan. After hearing from the spies, they would start gathering troops. They would also start borrowing money from the money lenders to finance the possible war. And the first move was made by the second son of Shah Jahan, called Shah Suja. He was the governor of Bengal, or he was the viceroy of Bengal at that time, and he had gathered a large army, and he had traveled through the width of North India, and he also had with him a group of ships that were traveling around the Ganges that accompanied him as a part of his fighting unit. So in time he would reach in front of the walls of the Agra fort, and in front of the walls he would meet the grandson of Shah Jahan, and he was the son of Dara Shikoh, the eldest son of Shah Jahan. The grandson of Shah Jahan, 25-year-old grandson of Shah Jahan, was Suleiman Shikoh. Suleiman Shikoh, along with his army, would confront Shah Suja, and ultimately in the battle Shah Suja would be defeated, And in the Agra fort, there would be celebrations after the win by Shah Suleiman Shukro. By this time, it was 1658, and I told you it was in 1657 that Shah Jahan was ill. In 1658, when the battle had um, occurred between Suleiman Shukro and Shah Shuja, and after the defeat of Suleiman Shukro, Shah Jahan would would be would would recover from his disease, and he would also come to the Agra fort. And he would also take part in the celebrations of the win of Suleiman Shukro, and but the celebrations would be cut short by another danger. The first danger was Shah Shuja had made the first move and wanted to have a claim over the throne. The second danger came from, if the first danger came from the second son, the second danger came from the alliance of the third and fourth son, Aurangzeb and Murad Baksh. This alliance was traveling from the Deccan region of India, and they were traveling very rapidly with their armies, and they were traveling through central India. And at a time, in April of 1658, at the end of April 1658, they had reached a place in central India called Ujjain, and all this rapidity happened despite the heat of April, and ultimately they would reach towards North India, and in the month of May 1658, they would reach a place called Samugar near Agra. So the alliance, the rebel army, had its own army, and the imperial army was facing the rebel army at this place called Samugar, and the imperial army was commanded by the eldest son of Shah Jahan, Dara Shikoh. So now let me just stop the narrative for some time and take this time to describe the army, the imperial army, as well as the army of the rebels. The imperial army were mainly recruited from the professions like butchers, barbers, blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, and these people had very little knowledge of war, but the imperial army had large numbers compared to the rebel army, the alliance of Aurangzeb and Murad Baksh. The imperial army had a large numbers. The rebel army only made about half the numbers of the imperial army. The imperial army consisted of, if you want to know the numbers, consisted of 100,000 cavalry, 25,000 musketeers, and also divisions of elephants and camels carrying this artillery. But the disadvantage they had was that the army was not so well trained and they didn't know much about war. Compared to that, as I told you, the rebel army was only almost half the size of the imperial army, but it was well trained and confident. But Aurangzeb, who was also leading the rebels along with Murad Baksh, would not completely depend on the prowess of his army. He had other tricks up his sleeve, and I'll talk about those tricks. So, having described the army on two sides at a place called Samugar near Agra, let me move forward and let me go to the day of the battle. It happened on 29th May 1687. At this time, the two armies were face to face with each other, and I told you that I will talk about the other tricks that Aurangzeb had. The trick that Aurangzeb had was his own cunning. He had also promised rewards among some flexible officers of the imperial army, and got a great proportion, or you can say a sizable proportion of those officers to his side. Those officers still acted as if they were in the imperial army, but they were working for Aurangzeb, and this had profound consequence in the course of the battle, as I'll tell you shortly. So if I go forward in May 29, 1658, it was a hot day. The two armies were facing each other. there was one of the agents of Aurangzeb called Khalilullah Khan. And Khalilullah Khan was a part of the imperial army but was an agent for Aurangzeb, would advise Dara Shikoh, the commander of the imperial army, to ensure that the imperial army makes the first move. Dara Shikoh would order his troops to make the first move based on this advice. They had a strong defensive position, but still Dara Shikoh would order his troops to move forward, and the troops consisted of the Rajput warriors. They would move forward ultimately, and but the problem was, as they kept moving forward, there was a time, the precise time at which the imperial army started shooting from their muskets, and the imperial army, the front line of the imperial army, consisting a lot of them consisted of the Rajputs, would perish. And seeing the present state of affairs, the soldiers who were following the front line would also would flee from the battle. But still, as the battle went forward, Dara Shikoh would still keep encouraging his army to keep moving forward, bear the brunt of the barrage of shots from the muskets of the enemy lines. And and what I want to say is Dara Shikoh had ensured that he had not wavered despite the initial blows on the Rajput warriors by the enemy lines consisting of Aurangzeb and Murad Baksh, and the imperial army would keep moving forward, and ultimately within few minutes, because Dara Shikoh did not waver from his position, ultimately within few minutes the imperial army would penetrate through the enemy lines. They would penetrate to the extent that the infantry of the enemy lines would flee, seeing the large numbers, and also because of the large numbers, they would flee, they would go away from the battlefield, the infantry portion of it. This was the time when most of the people observing the proceedings would think that the imperial army was in a dominant position and was going to win the battle. But once again, it is the cunning of Aurangzeb, the tactics of promising rewards to some of the officers of the imperial army had worked. Some of the officers in the imperial army had succeeded in assassinating some of the generals within the imperial army who would be sat exposed on their elephants. And one general who had been assassinated this way was called Ram Singh Rathore. Ram Singh Rathore had commanded the left wing of the imperial army, and having seen that their leader had perished, the left wing of the army had become despondent, had become demotivated, had become fearless, had become fearful and undisciplined. At this particular moment, another agent of Aurangzeb, the same agent I had talked about before, who had given advice to Dara Shikoh to let the troops advance, to let the troops of the imperial army make the first move. That same person, Khalilullah Khan, would come up with another advice for Dara Shikoh, seeing that the general of the left wing of the imperial army had perished. He would make another advice, and the advice was, he told Dara Shikoh to get down from his elephant and ride over to the left wing, so that he could motivate the soldiers of the left wing back into the battle again. Dara Shikoh, under the pressure of circumstances, under the panic of the battle, had paid heed to the advice again, and he would get down his elephant. And as soon as he would get down his elephant, his seat on the elephant was vacant, and there would be a rumor that would go about saying that Dara Shikoh had been killed. And this was the moment that Aurangzeb had been waiting for and had seized with both his hands. This was the moment that would entirely demotivate the troops of the imperial army, and which would ultimately lead to the defeat of the imperial army, despite them being in the dominant position when they had broken through the enemy lines after they had made the first move. And that was the moment that had decided the battle. That was the moment that had led to the uh, victory of the rebellion army consisting of the alliance of Aurangzeb and Murad Baksh. Once the imperial army had been defeated, Dara Shikoh had fled to Agra. There he had from meeting from meeting his father Shah Jahan, and had from Agra he had left to Delhi. Once and meanwhile the rebel army also, once that happened, after that the rebel army had also reached the Agra fort, where Shah Jahan had made his own plans to defeat the rebel army. But these plans were also once again foiled because there was an agent of Aurangzeb in the Agra fort, and the agent was within the family of Shah Jahan itself, the younger daughter of Shah Jahan, Rosnara Begum, the younger sister of Aurangzeb, Rosnara Begum. Rosnara Begum had succeeded in ensuring that Shah Jahan's plans to attack the rebel army was foiled, was undone. Once that had happened, it was easy for the rebel army to enter the Agra fort, and then the the army, the members of the troops, would rescue Roshnara Begum from the Agra fort, take her away from there, leave Shah Jahan in the palace, leave him under house arrest, and they would come out of Agra fort, and ultimately there would be celebrations of victory after they'd done that. The story is not complete here yet. During the victory celebrations, Shah Jahan would invite his younger brother Murad Baksh to his tent, get him heavily drunk, and once Murad Baksh was asleep, he would he would he would he would chain Murad Baksh secretly and send him to Delhi through by putting him on an elephant. And ultimately in Delhi, Murad Baksh would be thrown into a prison opposite the Red Fort of Delhi, and there he would be fed a certain kind of drink that was an extract of opium that would ensure that a person consuming it would ultimately um, become crippled and also insane within a matter of few months. And this way, Shah Jahan was clearing his way to ensure that he would ascend the throne of Delhi. He would become the emperor of the Mughals. He would become the emperor of the Mughal India.